Welcome. Rein Raud est un écrivain et un universitaire estonien, né dans une famille d'écrivains. Son père et sa mère, ainsi que son grand-père, sont des écrivains connus en Estonie, tout comme son frère et sa sœur. Il a commencé à écrire très tôt et son premier recueil de poèmes a été publié en 1980. Vous aviez donc 19 ans. Il est diplômé de l'université de Saint-Pétersbourg, alors Leningrad, parce qu'à l'époque, évidemment, on était en Union soviétique, comme j'ai noté, sous l'occupation de l'Union soviétique en Estonie, en 1985, donc, en études japonaises. Et il a soutenu sa thèse de doctorat en 1994 à Helsinki. Outre l'écriture littéraire, Rein est également un universitaire reconnu. Il a publié de nombreux ouvrages académiques, principalement des articles et monographies dans le domaine de la théorie culturelle et de la philosophie comparative. Il a par ailleurs enseigné à l'université d'Helsinki, les études japonaises, et dirigé l'université de Tallinn. Détail remarquable, Rein parle 20 langues, parmi lesquelles le japonais évidemment et le mandarin, pour ne citer qu'elle. À ce jour, il a publié 10 romans et une dizaine d'autres livres de genres différents, principalement des récits et des recueils de poésie. Il a reçu de nombreux prix littéraires. 3 de ses romans ont été publiés en anglais. Il s'agit de Reconstruction, l'histoire d'un père qui tente de comprendre la raison du suicide de sa fille dans une secte religieuse. The Brother, un court roman que son auteur qualifie de western spaghetti raconté en prose poétique, ainsi que The Death of the Perfect Sentence, une histoire d'amour et d'espionnage qui se déroule en Estonie pendant les dernières heures du pouvoir soviétique. Ces livres ont été traduits dans 9 langues.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for being here. Well, everybody says that, so do I. I much appreciate an audience interested in what we are having to say than people who would just come to join us for being polite. I'm going to read from The Death of the Perfect Sentence. As Sophie said, it is a spy and love story running in the last days or last months of Soviet power in Estonia. And the idea of the novel came to me in a dream, actually. I was like seeing a film, a Polish film, actually, which doesn't exist. And there was a chain of people who were transmitting some kind of information, and there was a dead drop, and there was a young man and a young woman who, one of them was passing the information, the other one was picking up. They didn't know that they were part of the same chain, but they kind of occurred in the same place often, and they met and fell in love. So that was the idea around which I built this novel. I wrote it, well, the motivation behind it is that when I did it, these events had already become a part of the past. And a kind of a narrative, an ideologically correct narrative had been forced on this past, that there were all these, valiant Estonians struggling for independence, and then there were all these evil Russians trying to hinder that and so on. They tried to show that things were much more complicated than that. I'm going to read a couple of extracts. In the first, we meet the young man who is going to fall in love much later with a girl from a chain of passing information. But here we see him working in a joint Soviet-Finnish venture and having just given an interview to a Finnish journalist. Alex looked at the Finnish woman sitting opposite him and found himself thinking that she was actually quite attractive, even pretty in her prim Nordic way, if it weren't for the ugly glasses she was wearing. But she looked naive, so awfully naive, like everybody else from the other side of the Iron Curtain. How could she expect that centuries of tradition and the fears which had fed them would disappear overnight, as if brushed aside with the edge of a palm, or that spines which were so used to stooping before their superiors would suddenly straighten, and that people's heads would turn out to be full of free-thinking ideas? Only a few were capable of changing like that, and it did not come naturally even to them. It was obvious that one had to proceed gradually and cautiously, without upsetting anything, without causing harm to anyone. How could she not understand that people who defended and kept this supposedly evil system artificially alive were not born evil themselves, but were, as far as they and others believed, living to perform their duty, doing their best for the good of society. They'd ended up in a dead end, of course, but people had now started to appear who could lead them out of the planned economy, out of Afghanistan, out of the single-party state with no rule of law. That was exactly what was happening, and the pace was head-spinningly fast for some. How could she not realize that? Celia looked at the Russian man sitting opposite her and found herself thinking that he was actually quite attractive, even handsome in his rough and ready Russian way, if it weren't for the ugly tie he was wearing. But he looked naive, so awfully naive, like everyone else from the other side of the Iron Curtain. How could he believe that it was possible to reform the system from within when it was so ineffective, so completely corrupt, built on irrational and inhumane principles from the very beginning? To introduce freedoms into people's lives and require that they exercise them responsibly while the fundamental things remained unchanged. It just wasn't possible. It wasn't possible to be a little bit free, just like you couldn't be a little bit pregnant, and you couldn't take flight with just one wing. Because something would always get in your way, either the realization that you have to throw off every last one of your chains to be really free, or a painful knock and loss of consciousness after colliding with the brick wall of reality. How could he not realize that? Next, we see two characters, a middle-aged Estonian couple who obviously hate the system but also are doing quite well by it. People who want something to change but not necessarily now or gradually, something like that. Always when we see them, time somehow stops. And one thing they don't know is that their son has in between become the head of an insurrectionist group of young people who were actually actively doing something. We see them at the moment when the same thought passes through both their minds. What if our marriage is over, come to an end? Rein's father is in the loo. He has just tugged his fly closed but not yet flushed the toilet, and he has coughed up the phlegm accumulated in his throat and spat it out. They've got a Polish toilet bowl with a flush button on the side of the cistern, not a cord hanging from the ceiling height. Meanwhile, his wife, who expects him to be absent from the room for a while, has swiftly opened the drinks cabinet door, taken out a bottle of Kirchberry Danish liqueur and a glass, and started pouring herself a drink. The large glob of spit and phlegm strikes the surface of the water at exactly the moment when the stream of sweet, sticky liquid reaches the bottom of the glass. And that is the very same moment when, completely independently of each other, they both think exactly the same thought. What if it is over? What if it really is? What next? Not that either of them had done anything wrong exactly, no. They strictly adhered to all the moral norms, or at least their understanding of those norms. But without some minor petty breaking of the laws, rules and conventions, it was impossible to survive in a society which was organized so that every single person felt a bit guilty before the state. But let's not stray from the subject. Rein's mother blames herself for secretly having been a little too proud of her son. She'd already seen a perfect little man in him from that time at grandfather's funeral when, barely 5, he was all dressed up in a black suit. It had seemed to come naturally to him to take up his place at the end of the row of people receiving the condolence messages and endure there for a whole hour and a half, looking serious and dignified as he shook every last guest's hand. She remembered that image, the clearest of all, from her father-in-law's funeral, not the journey to Pärnumäe, not the graveside speeches, nor the hysterical Biddy and her dim daughter whose existence they'd known nothing about while her father-in-law was still alive. No, she remembered her grown-up little boy most of all. He still caused a little slight sense of unease which she couldn't properly describe. She still wanted to poke her head around his door every evening and wave him good night, but it just wasn't appropriate anymore. Her tough little boy. But maybe she shouldn't have made so many assumptions. A person can't be shiny and indestructible like a precious stone, and even some of those can be quite opaque. But once you had got used to thinking of them as strong, then it doesn't occur to you that they might also have their weaknesses, and may occasionally need your help. Rein's mother did not know what her son's weaknesses were, but something clearly wasn't right if he didn't come home at night anymore. It's not that he simply didn't turn up, leaving her waiting until morning, sitting in the kitchen, tugging on a cigarette. He would phone in the evening and inform them that he wasn't coming home, but with no further explanation. You're not going to say, what do you mean you're not coming? We have cheesecake and there is a Hercule Poirot on Finnish television. Because if he still doesn't come, then it must be your fault. You must have been doing something wrong all along. Why else would he rather be somewhere else? Reim's father asks himself the same question, although from a different perspective. Maybe I should have been stricter with him, demanded more of him. You should always ask more of someone who is capable. Meanwhile, he is waiting to hear the plopping sound at any moment, because the glob of spit and phlegm has already arrived at the surface of the water. Technically, the process which will produce the plop has already begun. It's just that the air vibrations have not yet reached his ears. Maybe I should have insisted on a regime of early rising and workouts. That would have been good for me as well. We went running in the forest now and again in the summer. He liked that. We did squats and press-ups by the tree felled by the storm. Maybe I should have thought something up for winter as well, like cold showers to toughen the constitution, and I could have fixed a bar in the doorway to do chin-ups. Although to hell with cold water. The main thing is discipline, order, respect for one's parents. It's just not on. Phoning like that and saying you're not coming home without a word of explanation about where you are or what you're doing. What kind of home is it that you can just decide not to come back like that? What kind of family? No kind of family at all. Hell, damn it. I toil like an ox, and this is the thanks I get. And then, a millisecond or so later, the plopping sound reaches his ears, he presses the flush, and the water washes everything away. In the meantime, the son, Reim, is actually, he has seduced his former Russian teacher from school, who is now working as a typist for the KGB, and he has asked her to do a series of photos from the agent files, so that after independence is won back, one would know who has been collaborating with the KGB and who hasn't. And this is the moment when the woman realizes what their affair is all about. "What a bastard you are, my boy," said Lydia Petrovna, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. She was sitting up in bed and smoking, with her satin pyjama jacket open. Reim had just placed the Minox EC camera on the bedside cupboard and explained to Lydia Petrovna how to use it and what kinds of pictures she should take with it. For Reim, the moment which followed seemed to last much longer than it actually did, because he had little experience of such situations. But Lydia Petrovna now had two options. Her employers would assume that she would inform them about the conversation which had just taken place, and as a consequence, Reim would then be arrested, most probably followed by several of his friends and acquaintances, especially the acquaintance who had given Reim that wonderful piece of equipment invented by the Baltic German engineer. In other words, her employers would have assumed that she would betray her lover. Her lover, however, assumed that she would put her liberty and maybe even her life on the line to join a struggle that she didn't necessarily identify with, in order to enable something to pass across the border between two worlds, something which might eventually determine the fate of many people, most of whom she didn't even know. In other words, that she would betray her employers. The question was which of those scenarios would result in Lydia Petrovna betraying herself. In other words, there was no question.